Good evening, traveler. You've arrived late. Was the road long tonight? Sit. The fire is warm, and the stars are watching quietly. Quiet like the kind of night when even heaven holds its breath. But you see, some stories are only heard when the world goes still. And this one, the tale I'll share now, is not about kings or battles. It's about a tired man. A man of faith who ran. He didn't run from enemies. He ran from the weight of life. His name was Elijah. Yes, the prophet. But also a man, like me, like you. So before sleep finds you, listen closely. Tonight, between firelight and shadows, we'll walk together through deserts and silence, until we reach the place where God doesn't speak through thunder, but in a whisper. And before your eyes grow heavy, leave a comment if you'd like. Tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is. It's comforting to know we're not alone, that others are out there, under this same sky, still awake. Now, close your eyes if you wish. Take a deep breath, and listen with your heart. The story is about to begin. There was a night when heaven seemed to have forgotten how to speak. No wind stirred, no voice echoed. Even the stars stood still, like silent witnesses to the soul of a man hiding deep inside a cold mountain cave. That man was Elijah, the prophet, the one who once called down fire from the skies, now curled beneath stone, trembling with fear, exhaustion, and silence. He had fled, not from swords, not from soldiers, but from something far heavier, the emptiness, the stillness of a God who didn't answer. The desert didn't wound him with thorns. It wounded him with quiet. And in that terrible quiet, something inside Elijah broke. But what Elijah didn't know is that sometimes God doesn't shout. Sometimes he doesn't shake the earth or split the sky. Sometimes he comes in a whisper. And while Elijah wept in the shadows, something unseen began to move. A presence not loud or angry, but gentle. It didn't demand. It didn't rush. It simply waited to be heard. Maybe you, too, are curled in your own cave tonight, tired, overwhelmed, wondering if God has gone silent. But you're not alone, because the same voice that whispered to Elijah in the stillness may be whispering to you now. Close your eyes. Let go. Let's walk this path together, through the silence, toward the whisper. But how did Elijah get here? How does a prophet, once bold enough to challenge kings and call down fire from heaven, end up trembling in a cave, lost in silence? To understand the whisper, we must first return to the fire, to the mountaintop, to the moment when heaven answered with flame, and yet the soul of the prophet remained unlit. This is where the story truly begins. The mountain was still warm when Elijah began to descend. Smoke curled through the sky like the last breath of a miracle. Just moments ago, fire had fallen from heaven, devouring the altar, the stones, even the dust beneath it. The prophets of Baal had danced and bled in vain, crying out to gods who never answered. And then, with a single quiet prayer, Elijah had called upon the Lord... And fire came. It was undeniable. The people fell to their knees, crying out, "The Lord, He is God." Their voices echoed through the valley like a tide of repentance. The false prophets were brought to judgment. Justice was swift. The prophet stood still, his cloak rustling in the wind, his eyes lifted toward the sky. He had done everything right. He had obeyed. He had spoken. He had believed. And for a moment, it seemed the world might finally turn back to righteousness. But what came instead was a threat. Jezebel, the queen, cold and unmoved by the miracle, sent a message. No royal decree, no fear, just a vow soaked in venom. By this time tomorrow, you will be dead. It struck deeper than any sword. and the fire in Elijah's chest, the boldness that once roared, flickered and vanished. He fled, not out of cowardice, not because he stopped believing, but because the silence that followed the fire was louder than any voice. He had expected revival. What he found was resistance. He had hoped for rest. What he received was pursuit. So he ran into the wilderness, not to escape Jezebel, but to escape the crushing weight of disappointment, the weariness of standing alone. He walked until his feet gave out. Beneath the thin shadow of a broom tree, he collapsed. The sun beat down. The desert stretched endlessly. There were no angels in sight, no miracles, just dust and silence, and the sound of his own breathing. He whispered barely, "It is enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." And then he slept, not the rest of peace, but the collapse of a soul too empty to cry. He slept with nothing left inside him, no prophecy, no strength, no will. The prophet, the man of fire, had become dust beneath a tree. But heaven did not forget him. An angel came, not in fire, not in thunder, but in stillness. A gentle touch on his shoulder, the scent of warm bread, a jug of water placed beside him. "Get up and eat," the voice said, not a command, a kindness. Elijah opened his eyes. He saw no army, no heavenly chariots, only a meal, simple, human, softly divine. He ate and slept again, and once more the angel came, the same hand, the same voice. "Get up and eat, for the journey will be too much for you." And Elijah, this time, did not argue. He rose not in strength, but in surrender. He took the bread, he drank the water, and with it he found just enough to walk, not to conquer, not to perform, just to walk. He walked for 40 days and 40 nights, through barren land, past silence and sun and stone, his footsteps slow, his heart still, quiet, until he came to a mountain, an ancient one, Horeb, the mountain of God, the place where, long ago, another man named Moses had seen a bush burn without being consumed, the place where God had spoken in thunder and cloud. Elijah arrived not as a warrior, not as a prophet, on fire, but as a man in need. He found a cave in the side of the mountain, and there, alone, surrounded by stone and silence, he lay down, waiting, not for fire, not for signs, just for God. The cave was not large. It did not echo with wonder or promise. It was a hollow place, carved by time and wind, nothing more. Cold stone walls, a dark ceiling, a narrow opening where faint light crept in and died quietly on the floor. Elijah sat inside it, knees pulled to his chest, eyes staring at nothing. The mountain around him was vast and ancient, but inside the cave there was only stillness. Time seemed to slow there, the kind of stillness that presses down on the chest, the kind that turns minutes into hours and hours into questions. He had traveled far. His feet ached. His cloak was worn and stained with dust. His heart was a shadow of what it once was. He had seen miracles. He had heard the voice of God before. He had known what it felt like to be filled with power, to speak and have heaven respond. But now, all he heard was the wind slipping past the rocks, the silence after the fire. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was tired, deep, soul-heavy tired. And so, when the voice came, it surprised him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It wasn't harsh. It wasn't accusatory. It was tender, curious, as if the question wasn't to shame him, but to draw him out. Elijah didn't lift his eyes. He simply answered, his voice low, the words slow. "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts." The children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets. I alone am left, and now they seek my life as well. There it was, the wound beneath the skin. He felt abandoned, alone, outnumbered. He had done everything he knew to do, and still the world remained unchanged. He wasn't just running from Jezebel. He was running from despair, from futility, from the weight of being faithful, and still feeling forgotten. There was no reply, just silence again. Elijah stayed in the cave, waiting, listening, hoping that anything might break the stillness. Then the voice returned, calm, direct. Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Something stirred in Elijah's chest. He rose slowly, cautiously, and stepped toward the edge of the cave. Outside, the wind had begun to rise. It howled through the cliffs, fierce and furious, tearing at the rocks, shaking the very foundations of the mountain. Elijah covered his face with his cloak. The wind roared like judgment, like fury unleashed. But the Lord was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake. The ground beneath Elijah trembled violently. Stones fell, dust rose. The earth cracked and groaned beneath the pressure of unseen hands. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, fire. Flames rose, searing the horizon. They danced along the mountain's edge, wild and consuming, as they had once done on Carmel. But the Lord was not in the fire. And then, silence. A stillness so deep it seemed to pulse with breath. The kind of quiet that makes your heart beat louder. A kind of hush that falls not over the land, but inside the soul. And in that moment, Elijah felt it. A whisper, not with his ears, but with his heart. A presence, gentle and near. A voice, softer than the wind, quieter than breath. It didn't shout. It didn't demand. It simply was, and it filled the cave, and Elijah, completely. He pulled his cloak over his face, not out of fear, but out of reverence. For he knew this was God, not the God of storms or flames, not the God who conquers with force, but the God who comes close, the God who whispers. In that silence, Elijah understood something he had never grasped before. That God was not only in the grand displays, not only in power and might, but in stillness, in waiting, in presence. That the whisper was not weakness, but intimacy. And for the first time in many nights, Elijah's soul exhaled. Elijah remained still for a long time after the whisper faded. The silence lingered, not as absence, but as comfort. It wrapped around him like a blanket. Not cold but warm, not empty but full. He had heard the voice of God not as thunder, not as judgment, but as breath. And in that breath, he had found something he did not expect, peace. He uncovered his face slowly. Outside, the wind had settled. The earth was still. The fire had vanished. All that remained was the mountain, the sky, and the quiet presence of the one who had come close. Elijah stepped out of the cave. The air felt different now, lighter, as if the weight he had carried for so long had been lifted, not because his circumstances had changed, but because his heart had. He looked out across the wilderness. The same barren land stretched before him, but now he saw it differently, not as a punishment, not as proof of failure, but as part of the path. God had not abandoned him. He had led him here to this place, this moment, this stillness for a reason. The voice came again. This time it gave direction. Gentle, clear, and full of purpose. Go back the way you came. There was no rebuke, no shame, only calling. God was not finished with Elijah. His journey was not over. He was to anoint kings, to find the one who would walk after him, to pass on the mantle that once burned with holy fire. But more than that, he was to rise and walk, not as a prophet burdened by the world, but as a man carried by the whisper of God. Elijah listened, and he obeyed. He began the journey back, not with haste, but with steadiness. Each step pressed into the dust, marking a return not just to duty, but to life. Along the way, the land seemed to breathe with him. The trees rustled softly. The wind whispered low. The sun warmed his skin. He no longer walked alone. The God who had fed him under the broom tree, who had sustained him through 40 silent days, who had spoken without sound, was walking with him. The journey became sacred, a return not just to people, but to purpose. He was not the same man who had fled in fear. He had not become stronger, not in the way men measure strength. He had become softer, still, anchored dark, and perhaps that was the true strength, knowing when to run to God instead of from him. Knowing that caves can become sanctuaries. That silence can be a sanctuary. That whispers can carry more weight than storms. As Elijah walked, memories came back to him. Moments of power, of awe, of divine glory. But now, those memories were no longer burdens. They were reminders, markers of grace. God had always been there in the fire. Yes, but also in the famine, in the solitude, in the quiet. He remembered the angel's bread, the gentle hand, the question, "What are you doing here?" And he realized God had never been angry with his fear. He had simply wanted Elijah to know that he was seen, that the journey was never meant to be carried alone, that even prophets could collapse under the weight of hope deferred. When Elijah finally reached the edge of the wilderness, he paused. The road ahead would be busy again. Kings, people, conflict. But he was ready. Not because the world had changed, but because he had. The whisper had carved something deep within him, deeper than doubt, deeper than fear. A knowing that the voice of God was not a distant thunder, but a close breath, and that even in the quietest nights, that breath would still be near. The road stretched ahead, familiar yet changed. Elijah walked with steady steps, no longer driven by fear, but led by quiet purpose. The whisper still echoed in his soul, not with sound, but with certainty. God had spoken, not just to comfort him, but to realign him. The mission he once thought finished had only shifted. There were still things to be done, kings to anoint, a prophet to find. The future still waited for his hands to move. He traveled, south then east, crossing paths and streams, through open fields and narrow passes. As he walked, the sun warmed the back of his neck, and the breeze moved gently through the tall grasses. It was not the whirlwind that carried him, it was rest. Even in motion, he carried peace. And then, one day, he saw him. A young man in the distance, working the land with a quiet diligence. Hands strong from labor, shoulders bent from the weight of oxen and yoke. There were 12 yoke of oxen, a sign of wealth, of legacy. But the man behind them bore something else: humility, the kind that cannot be taught, only grown in silence. This was Elisha. Elijah approached without words. The moment needed none. The prophet removed his cloak, a simple weathered garment. The same cloak that had covered his face in the cave. The same cloak that had felt the fire of Mount Carmel and the wind on Horeb. He stepped beside the young man and placed the cloak over his shoulders. Elisha froze. The plow came to a halt. The oxen stirred, but the air remained still. In that single gesture, Elijah had spoken everything that needed to be said. The calling was past. The mantle transferred. Elisha looked into the eyes of the prophet, searching for explanation, but finding only quiet conviction. He understood, deeply, fully. The moment required no thunder, no ceremony, just surrender. Elisha turned back toward the field, slaughtered the oxen, and burned the plow. He cooked the meat and fed it to the people around him. It was a farewell, a statement. There would be no return to the soil, no going back to the ordinary. He had been claimed by something greater, by a story that had begun in silence, and now passed on in peace. And so Elisha followed Elijah, quietly, faithfully, not as a servant only, but as a witness. He watched how the prophet walked, how he listened, how he moved through the world with a heart tuned not to noise, but to presence. Elijah did not speak often, but when he did, Elisha listened with everything in him, for he knew this man had spoken with God, and even more, this man had been broken by God and healed by him, not days turned to weeks. The road stretched on. Elijah continued his journey, fulfilling what had been spoken. He anointed kings, gave words of judgment and guidance. But all the while, his steps grew lighter, not because the work was done, but because the burden was no longer his alone. The mantle had begun to rest on new shoulders. He would not live forever, and he knew it. But that no longer frightened him. There was no fear in finishing well. There was no sorrow in handing over the flame, so long as the fire remained. The whisper had taught him that his value was never in what he accomplished, but in who he belonged to. And that voice, the still, small one, had never left his side. As the two men walked together one evening, Elisha broke the silence. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he said. His voice was not greedy, not proud, only hungry for what was holy. Elijah smiled. He had once been a man who begged for death beneath a tree. Now, someone was asking for his fire. "You've asked a hard thing," he replied, "but if you see me when I'm taken from you, it will be yours." The journey was nearing its end, but even the end, Elijah knew, would be touched by wonder. The sky was quiet that morning, washed in soft tones of gold and blue. The air felt lighter, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Elijah walked beside Elisha along the winding path, not speaking much, only watching the way the sunlight danced on the leaves, the way the wind passed gently through the trees. Each step forward felt like a letting go, not of purpose, but of weight. The mission was nearly complete. The fire had come and gone. The silence had spoken. And now, something beyond both waited at the edge of the horizon. They passed through Gilgal, then Bethel, then Jericho. At each place, the sons of the prophets came out and whispered to Elisha, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" And Elisha nodded, always answering the same way, "Yes, I know. Be silent." There was a sacredness to the moment he didn't want disturbed, a stillness he had learned to respect, the same stillness that Elijah had carried with him since Horeb. They came to the Jordan River, and Elijah paused. He took his cloak, the same one that had covered his face on the mountain, and rolled it tightly in his hands. Then, with calm authority, he struck the waters, and the river parted. Not with thunder, not with violence, but with reverence. A path opened through the water, and the two men crossed on dry ground, as if walking through memory itself, through echoes of Moses and miracles. On the other side, they stood for a moment, alone with the wind and the trees and the silence between them. Elijah turned to Elisha, and though he had passed the mantle already, he spoke as a father would to a son. "Ask me what I can do for you before I am taken." And Elisha, with eyes steady and voice sure, said, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." It was not a request for power. It was a longing to carry forward the whisper, to walk as Elijah had walked, not in might, but in trust. Elijah nodded slowly. "You have asked a hard thing," he said, "but if you see me when I am taken, it will be yours." And then, Before another word could be spoken, the heavens stirred. There was no warning, no trumpet, no shout. Just a sudden rush of wind, not violent, but full. The air shimmered, the sky opened, and from above came something. Neither man had ever seen chariots of fire and horses of flame. They moved with grace and glory, descending like lightning wrapped in silence. A whirlwind rose between the two prophets, not a storm of chaos, but of separation. Holy, beautiful, final dot, and in the blink of a breath, Elijah was lifted. The prophet, who once ran from death, was now carried by light. No pain, no fear, only ascent. The whisper had become wind, and the wind had become home. Elisha cried out, "My father, my father!" The chariots and horsemen of Israel. But there was no reply, only fire and sky. And then stillness. The cloak drifted down. Elisha picked it up, his hands trembling. He held it close. It smelled of smoke and mountain air. It carried the weight of legacy. And in that moment, the silence that had once broken Elijah filled Elisha with purpose. He turned back toward the river. The sons of the prophets watched from a distance. Elisha took the cloak in his hand, walked to the edge of the Jordan, and struck the water. Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? And the river parted not because of Elisha, but because the whisper had chosen to remain. The fire had risen to heaven, but the still, small voice stayed, and as the river closed behind him, Elisha walked forward, not to be Elijah, but to follow the same voice, the one that spoke in caves, in deserts, in bread, in breath. And somewhere beyond clouds and stars, Elijah rode the wind, no longer weary, no longer broken, but wrapped in glory. The man of fire who had learned the beauty of silence now rested in the eternal whisper of God. And now, dear traveler, the story has been told. Elijah's journey from fire to fear, from silence to whisper, was never just his alone. It was yours too, mine, ours. Because all of us at some point find ourselves in caves of quiet, wondering if heaven still hears. But tonight, we've seen that the God who answered with fire is the same God who comes near in stillness. The same God who sends chariots of flame is the one who bakes bread in the desert. He does not forget. He does not forsake. He speaks not always with thunder, but often with peace. So let your heart rest now. You do not need to be strong. You do not need to carry it all. You only need to be still and know that he is God. In a moment, the story will end. But the fire will remain. The screen will fade, and only the soft sound of this humble fire will stay crackling gently beneath the stars. Let it warm you. Let it comfort you. Let it carry you into sleep. May your night be gentle. May your dreams be kind. And may you awaken tomorrow, knowing you are not alone. Sleep well, traveler. The fire is yours now.